From the window of the butler's pantry, old Heb watched the mist lift off the park at Thornley, and thought that a house could die the way a strong man goes to the bad, not all at once, but by 100 small surrenders nobody troubled to count. The hatchment still hung black over the great door, for the Dowager Duchess was 3 weeks in the vault, and already the carters had begun hauling out her furniture for the auction. Below him, crossing the wet grass with her shawl pinned tight and her boots soaked to the ankle, went the companion, Miss Rosa Calvert, walking fast toward the shouting that had started down at the Peascod gate. Heb had served the family for 40 years, and he had learned to measure people not by what they said of themselves, but by which direction they walked when there was trouble. Everyone else in the parish walked away from Lachlan Mundy's bailiffs. The small chestnut-haired woman in the darned shawl walked toward them. Rosa heard the cow before she saw the men. It was Widow Peascod's red cow, the only one the old woman had, and it was bellowing with its head roped short to the gatepost, while 2 of the steward's men hauled at it, and a third stood by with a switch. The beast's eyes had gone white-rimmed with terror, and it had planted its feet in the mud the way frightened creatures do when they have decided that whatever waits ahead is worse than any beating behind. The widow stood in her doorway with her work-swollen hands pressed to her mouth, saying nothing, because 40 years of being poor had taught her that complaining only raised the price of things. Rosa did not shout. She had learned long ago that shouting was a coin spent mostly by people who had no other. She walked up quietly, set her basket down in the mud, and put herself between the switch and the cow. Then she did a thing the bailiffs did not understand at all. She turned her back on the men, stood very still beside the animal's head, and let it smell her hands, which smelled of the still room, of dried lavender and bruised mint. She spoke to it low, nonsense words, the sort a mother uses on a fevered child, and the cow's breathing slowed, and its ears came forward, and after a minute it leaned its great rough head against her shoulder like a penitent. The men stood foolish with their ropes gone slack. Only then did she turn to them, and her voice was as level as a swept floor. She said that the Candlemas rent had been paid in full, that she had watched Widow Peascod count out the coins herself upon the kitchen table, and that it was all set down. From under her shawl she brought a plain calf-bound book, opened it to the page, and held it out so they could see the widow's mark and the date and the sum in a small, exact hand. Distraint upon a paid rent, she told them mildly, was a matter for the assizes, and she would be glad to write to the magistrates that very morning if they wished to put the question to a proof. She had, she added, an excellent memory for faces. The men looked at one another, and then passed her, and Rosa became aware that a horseman had stopped in the lane and was watching. He sat tall and dark-browed in the saddle, black from hat to boot, wearing his face the way a house wears its shutters, closed against weather and visitors alike. She knew him from the funeral, though he had not once spoken to her there. Fitzwilliam, the new Duke of Thornley, his mother's only living child, come home at last to bury her, and to break up everything she had loved. He watched the bailiffs slink off with their ropes, and he looked at Rosa for a long moment, with no expression she could name, and then he turned his horse and rode on without a word. That evening she learned from the kitchen that his Grace had given his orders to Heb, in a voice like a door closing. The household was to be reduced. The companion was to be turned off with the rest. Sentiment, he had said, was a luxury he had buried. She gathered herself quietly, as she had gathered herself before. Rosa Calvert was 24 years old, and she had been earning her bread since she was 19, and the story of how a clergyman's daughter came to be counting other people's linen was a common enough story that nobody ever asked to hear it. Her father had been a gentle, bookish rector, who died of a winter fever with his sermon half written, leaving his only child £800, safe in trust, payable to her when she reached the age of 25, and not a day before. The trustee was his brother, Ezekiel Calvert, a corn merchant with a florid face and a fine coat, who took the orphan in, and took the fund in hand, and within 2 years had contrived to persuade himself that money lying idle was an offence against Providence. He put it into his own ventures. The ventures failed, as his ventures did, and when Rosa, at 19, asked to see the trust accounts, her uncle turned so purple and so loud that she understood the accounts no longer existed to be seen. He wanted her married quickly to one of his creditors, a widower of 50 with damp hands, so that the question of the £800 might be buried in a settlement drawn by his own attorney. Instead, she answered an advertisement and went 200 miles north and became companion to the Dowager Duchess of Thornley. The old Duchess, Hortensia, had frightened away 4 companions in 3 years, and she took one look at the small, steady creature in the mended gloves and said that she supposed this one would bolt by Christmas like the rest. Rosa had not bolted. For 5 years she had read to her, and walked with her, and quarrelled with her agreeably about sermons, and nursed her through the long last winter when the pain came. The Duchess had a tongue like a paring knife, and a mind that age had not clouded by so much as a breath. She once told Rosa that the sentence, "I am sorry for your loss," was the least useful sentence in the English language, being addressed always to the loss and never to the living. She said that a ledger honestly kept was the one honest room in the world, the only place where things were exactly what they claimed to be. And she said, in the last month, with her hand like a bundle of dry sticks on Rosa's wrist, that she had watched her steward Lachlan Mundy smile for 11 years, and had concluded that no honest man had ever needed to smile that much. It was then that the old woman gave her the book, not the estate rent book that lived in Mundy's office, fair copied and ruled in red, but a plain calf-bound volume the Duchess had kept herself, year upon year, from her own knowledge and the tenants' own mouths, of what was truly paid and truly owed on the lands she held in her own right. For the manor of Underfell, with its 14 farms and its mills and its cottages, had never been Thornley entail. It had come to Hortensia from her own mother, hers absolutely, and by her will it passed to her son burdened with one condition she had signed and sealed and witnessed, while she could still hold a pen. "Keep the book," she told Rosa, "and say nothing until saying something will do good. There is more provided for you than the book, but it is lodged where careful things are lodged, and it will find you when it is wanted." Rosa had wept afterward, not at the mystery but at the trust. Nobody had trusted her with anything since her father died. Now the Duchess was in the vault, and Rosa walked the estate in the days before her dismissal took effect, and read the land the way she read a ledger, and what she read there frightened her. The great meadow below Underfell Mill stood flooded because the drainage channels had not been scoured in 6 years, though the accounts, she would later learn, showed them scoured every autumn. She pushed through gates that swung on one hinge, past the lime kiln gone cold, and counted as she walked, cottage roof after cottage roof going green with rot, and through it all moved Mundy, ruddy and obliging, in a good broadcloth coat, lifting his hat to everyone, holding every key, and the tenants went quiet when he passed. The way birds go quiet when a hawk crosses the sun. Heb, who told her things in the pantry in a low voice with the door open so it should not look like conspiracy, said only that the steward had had 11 years of a house given over to sickness and mourning, a mistress too old to ride the bounds, and, these last 4 years, a master too far away to care, and that the summer would bring the auction of the household goods and the settling of all accounts, and after that, God help Underfell. The auction was fixed for the last week of July. Rent day was Lammas, the 1st of August. She counted the weeks the way a prisoner counts them. Her dismissal, as it happened, was postponed by arithmetic. The lawyers required the household accounts reconciled before the auction, and the household accounts were 4 years in arrears, and the only person under that roof who could make a column of figures confess was the companion. Heb said as much to his Grace, respectfully, with his eyes on the middle distance. The Duke was silent for a moment, and then said that the woman might stay until the books were settled, and that she was to be paid, and that he did not wish to be troubled about it further. It was not kindness. Rosa understood that perfectly. It was the convenience of a man who signed what was put before him, rather than read it, because reading it meant being alive in a house where his mother had died, and he could not yet bear to be alive there. But convenience opened doors that kindness never would have, and Rosa went through every one of them with a pen in her hand. She began small, because small was where the truth lived. She paid the honest tradesmen whose bills had been let stand 2 years, while other bills, she noticed, were paid the week they were rendered. She had the still room scrubbed and the linen press aired and the kitchen book ruled fresh, and she sat with the cook over the daily accounts until the woman stopped being afraid of her and started being proud of the figures. She sent the thatcher, on her own authority and out of the household fund, to look at 3 cottage roofs, and entered it plainly, and dared anyone to question it. The servants, who had been drifting about the stripped house like people after a shipwreck, found that there was order again, and meals at hours and wages on the day, and they attached themselves to her with the unreasoning loyalty of the rescued. The red cow, which Widow Peascod insisted on calling Rosa's cow now, took to walking to the field gate whenever Rosa passed on the lane, and lowing at her until spoken to, which the parish found very funny, and which Rosa pretended to find undignified, and did not. It was in the 3rd week of her reprieve that she found the first crack in the wall, a receipt loose in a drawer of the Duchess's writing desk, in Mundy's own hand, acknowledging the Candlemas rent of Matthias Stoke of Underfell Grange, paid in full, £31 10s. She checked it against the estate ledger that had come up to the house for the reconciling. The ledger showed Stoke's farm £11 in arrears, and a note in red proposing that the arrears be added to the Lammas demand. She sat very still for a long time with the receipt under her palm. Then she checked the Duchess's own calf-bound book, and there was Stoke's rent, paid in full, on the day, in the old woman's small, fierce hand. One entry might be a slip of the pen. She spent 3 evenings, after the house was asleep, going entry by entry, and it was not a slip of the pen. It was a system. Rents collected whole and entered short. Repairs charged and never made. The difference flowing quietly, year upon year, into some pocket she could not yet see but could name without hesitating. She said nothing yet, because the Duchess had told her to say nothing until it would do good, and an accusation without proof would do nothing but get her turned out a fortnight early. But the house has a way of throwing people together, and in the evenings the Duke had taken to sitting in his mother's small parlour, which had been left unstripped by his one countermanded order, and one wet night he found Rosa there, cataloguing the Duchess's letters for the lawyers, and did not send her away. He asked abruptly whether his mother had suffered at the end. Rosa told him the truth, which was that she had suffered, and had been very brave about it, and very rude about it, and had made the apothecary cry on 2 occasions, which she had counted among her final victories. Something moved in the Duke's shut face, the ghost of a smile that did not arrive but was seen to be considered. He stayed. She read him one of the letters, and then another. His mother's voice came up off the paper, dry and unsparing and alive, and somewhere past midnight the Duke of Thornley put his head in his hands, and Rosa looked into the fire and gave him the privacy of her silence. And when he finally spoke, it was to say that he had stayed away 4 years, because he could not forgive this house for being where his father and his sister died, and that his mother had paid the price of his absence, and that he had known it, and had come home only when home meant a funeral. Rosa said that grief made cowards of everyone at least once, and that the measure of a person was the second occasion, not the first. He looked at her then, really looked, the way he had looked in the lane, and said quietly that his mother's letters mentioned a companion who cheated at piquet. Rosa replied that her Grace had been mistaken, and had also been losing. After that night he did not exactly seek her company, but he stopped avoiding the rooms she was in, and in a house that size, that is a language. It was Heb who brought her the box. He came to the still room one evening carrying a locked walnut case the size of a Bible, set it on the table, and laid beside it a key on a black ribbon that Rosa recognised, because the Duchess had worn it to her deathbed. Her Grace's instructions, Heb said, were that the box should go to Miss Calvert when Miss Calvert had need of it, and that Heb should judge the hour, and that if he judged it wrong she would come back and haunt him, which, he said, with the first joke he had made in 3 weeks, was not a risk a sensible man took with that particular lady. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk, lay a document engrossed on parchment, signed, sealed, and witnessed by the Duchess's own lawyer and her physician. It was a deed of agency. It named Rosa Calvert sole receiver of the rents of the manor of Underfell for a term of 7 years from the testatrix's death, her authority to stand irrevocable unless dishonesty were proved against her, before the justices, all moneys to be accounted quarterly to the estate, and it recited, in the old woman's own unmistakable dictation, the reason, which was that the testatrix had satisfied herself that her rents were safer in the hands of her companion than in the hands of her steward, and that she was accustomed to being right. Beneath the deed lay letters, and Rosa read them with her heart knocking. The Duchess had not been idle in her last year. She had written to an attorney in the South Country, and the attorney had written back, and the letters concerned the marriage settlement and trust accounts of the late Reverend Calvert, and what his brother Ezekiel had done with them, and what Chantry would say about it when asked. The old woman had known everything. She had gathered Rosa's own broken inheritance into her case, like a general gathering a second regiment, and had said not one word, and had died with the ambush laid. Rosa put the deed back in the silk and did not use it. Lammas was 5 weeks off, and a deed produced too early was a deed Mundy would have 5 weeks to lawyer against. Instead, She did a quieter and more dangerous thing. She went into the steward's office. She had a reason ready, the reconciling of the household coal account, and she chose an afternoon when Mundy was at the market town, and it was there, behind the estate ledger on the shelf, bound identically, that she found the second book. Fair copy and true copy. The ledger for showing and the ledger for knowing. In the second book, Mundy kept his real accounts, meticulous as any honest man's, and that was the horror of it, the neatness. 11 years of theft ruled and dated and carried forward, rents taken whole and entered short, repair monies drawn and pocketed, and a column toward the back of leases. She unfolded one from the drawer beneath and compared it against the counterpart in the muniment room later that night. The tenant's copy and the estate's copy did not agree. Rents had been raised on paper the estate never saw, and the difference was Mundy's, and the tenants, who could not all read, had put their marks to figures that were read aloud to them falsely. He had been robbing the dead woman for years, and now he was robbing her grave. He caught her, of course. Thieves keep good watch. He came back early and stood in his own doorway filling it, and his voice stayed pleasant the whole time, which was the worst thing about it. He said he wondered at a young person rummaging where she had no business, a young person with no family to speak of and no character but a dead woman's word, and the county about to gather for an auction where everything under this roof would be sorted into what was kept and what was sold. "Companions," he said, smiling, "are sold with the chairs, Miss Calvert." Rosa straightened the coal account under her arm and replied that she was grateful for the warning, and that he would find, if it ever came to a sorting, that she kept excellent accounts. She walked past him with her spine straight and her knees trembling, and did not let the trembling reach her voice until she was alone in the still room with the door bolted, and then only for a minute, because trembling, like shouting, was a coin she could not afford. What hardened her from caution into purpose was rain. It rained for 2 days together at the turn of July, and she walked down to Widow Peascod's cottage and stood inside it and watched the water come through the roof in 3 places, into a basin, into a bucket, and onto the foot of the bed of a woman of 70 who had paid, Rosa knew to the shilling, every rent ever demanded of her, including the false ones. The estate books showed that roof new thatch 3 years since. The widow apologised for the weather. Something in Rosa that had been patient all its life stopped being patient that afternoon. But she had learned method from ledgers, so her impatience took the form of 3 more weeks of quiet work. With Matthias Stoke to vouch for her, and he was a weathered, plain-spoken yeoman whose word the parish trusted the way it trusted daylight, she went from farm to farm in the evenings. She read each tenant their lease aloud, truly for the first time. She showed them, each one, their own rents in the Duchess's book. She took their sworn marks on what they had actually paid, dated, and witnessed, and she gathered the tally sticks and the tradesmen's bills that agreed with no ledger Mundy had ever shown the family. She told them all one thing more, which was that the Duchess had made provision, and that come Lammas they should pay their rents to no hand until they saw her Grace's own seal, and Stoke looked at her a long moment under his white eyebrows, and said that the old Duchess had chosen shrewd, and that Underfell would stand where she stood. A shilling of proof at a time, the case grew, hidden under the floor of the still room where the lavender was stored, because nobody suspects lavender. The auction came before rent day, as auctions and injustices come at the worst hour. The county gathered in the forecourt under a hard blue sky, gentry in their carriages and dealers with their catalogues, and the Duchess's life was carried out piece by piece and held up and knocked down, her chairs, her fire screens, her little French clock. The Duke stood apart in black, enduring it like surgery, having convinced himself that emptiness was the same as peace. Lady Drusilla Verrill came early and stayed close to him, handsome and sharp and 30, with her whole future mortgaged to the hope of being Duchess of Thornley. And it was she, Rosa learned afterward, who had spent a month writing letters to distant connections about the mysterious Miss Calvert, and it was Mundy who had told her where to write. What those letters raised came up the drive at noon in a hired chaise. Ezekiel Calvert had grown fatter and his coat finer, and he came sweating across the gravel with the particular fury of a debtor who has located his debt. Before half the county he denounced her, his own niece, run off from his guardianship 5 years since, an ungrateful, scheming creature who had wormed her way to a dying woman's elbow under a genteel manner she had no fortune to support, and who would now come home with him to the duty and obedience she owed. And Mundy, seeing his hour, stepped forward all sorrow and reluctance and said that it grieved him, but the accounts Miss Calvert had lately meddled with were found to be in disorder, and that his grace would be wise to see the woman off the premises with the rest of the goods today, before she pocketed anything smaller than a chair. The yard went silent, and every face turned to the Duke, and the Duke failed her. Not from cruelty. Rosa saw exactly what it was, and the seeing was its own separate wound. He was a man not 3 months from his mother's coffin, ambushed in public, looking at a woman he had known a matter of weeks against a steward of 11 years, and a kinsman with law on his side, and grief had taught him one trick only, which was to freeze. He said, at last, in a voice with nothing in it, that if the household was dispersing, Miss Calvert's engagement was concluded with the rest, and that her wages should be paid in full. Lady Drusilla let out a small breath. Mundy bowed. Ezekiel started forward to claim her arm. Rosa stepped back from him once and stood still, and found that she was not going to weep and was not going to beg, and heard her own voice come out level across the whole forecourt. She said that she would take no man's arm, and that she required nothing from that house except what she had carried into it. She said that accounts had a way of settling themselves, and that in 1 week it would be Lammas, and the rents would speak, and everyone at Thornley might listen to what they said. Then she thanked Heb, before them all, for his kindness, curtsied to the Duke exactly as deep as his rank required, and not 1 inch deeper, and walked out of the yard with her 1 box, down the lane, where Matthias Stokes' wife was already waiting at their gate with her arms open, because the parish had known for a week what the county learned that day. The last thing Rosa heard from the forecourt was the auctioneer's hammer, and the first thing she heard at the Grange was the red cow, bawling at the field gate until Rosa came, and stood with her forehead against its warm neck, and the beast stood patient as a wall, the only creature in the county, Rosa thought, that had never once required her to prove anything. Lammas came in bright and hot. Rent day at Underfell was held by ancient custom at the manor office by the mill, and Mundy sat at the table with the estate ledger open and a strong box at his elbow, and beside him, at the Duke's instruction, a dry London agent brought in to observe the settling, and behind them, come to see the estate's business done because it was his now, and his mother's memory demanded at least attendance, the Duke himself. The tenants came up the lane together. That was the first wrong sign, for tenants come singly, shuffling, cap in hand. They came all 14 farms together with their wives, walking like a jury. Matthias Stoke came first, and he laid his rent on the table in a canvas bag, £31.10, counted and true, and then set his brown hand flat over it, and said that he was ready to pay, and would pay that hour, but not to the steward, and, begging his Grace's pardon, not to the London gentleman neither. Underfell would pay its rents to the receiver the old Duchess had lawfully appointed, and to no other hand living. Mundy laughed and asked what receiver, and the tenants parted, and Rosa Calvert walked up between them in her grey dress with a walnut box under her arm, and it was Widow Peascod, of All Souls, who spoke into the silence, saying, "Her, sirs, her that the house sold with the chairs." Rosa set the box on the table before the Duke, unlocked it, and laid the deed of agency on the estate ledger, seal upward. She named its witnesses, the lawyer and the physician, both present that day in the crowd by her arrangement, and both nodding. Then she laid the Duchess's true rent book beside the false ledger, and beside them the second ledger, Mundy's own, which the London agent had that morning removed from behind the first at her written direction, and then the forged leases against their honest counterparts, and the tally sticks, and the tenants' sworn marks, and the tradesmen's bills, every scrap of which Heb had lifted from beneath the still-room floor on the night of the auction, and carried down to the Grange under a basket of linen, item after item, in the order she had rehearsed in the still-room, a case 11 years deep laid out in 20 minutes, and no voice raised anywhere in it. The Duke read. She watched him read, standing straight on the other side of the table, and she watched the exact moment the freeze broke, because it did not break as anger first. It broke as shame. He came to the page where his own signature approved a false abstract 2 winters past, and he put his finger on it and said, aloud, before his tenants, that here was his own hand, that he had signed what was put before him rather than read it, because reading his mother's affairs had hurt him, and that the man beside him had stolen with a pen, but that he himself had opened the door and held it, and the estate had 2 men to forgive, not 1. It was the first fully honest sentence Rosa had ever heard him say in company, and the county repeated it for a year, and argued over it for longer, whether the thief or the absent master owed Underfell the greater debt, and Rosa never settled the argument for anyone, because she thought the arguing itself was the health returning. For Mundy, there was no argument. Confronted with his own neat columns, he went from pleasant to pale to spitting inside a minute, and the last mask off him was the true face, mean and small and certain to the end that cleverness had been owed a reward and had only collected it. He told Rosa she had been nothing but a paid ear at a dying woman's pillow. Rosa replied that he was quite right, that she had been paid to listen and that she had listened, and perhaps he ought to have hired someone to do the same. The constables took him to the market town that afternoon. At the Michaelmas Assizes he was convicted on the books he himself had kept. His bond and sureties were called in, his goods and his snug hidden freehold, bought with underfell rents, were seized and sold, and the sum recovered went back, every shilling that could be traced, into the estate, and the estate at Rosa's accounting put it into roofs. He was sentenced to transportation, and the parish, which had feared his smile for 11 years, discovered within a month that it could barely remember his face. Ezekiel Calvert had come to the rent day too, scenting his niece's disgrace, and instead stood in the mill yard while the duchess's lawyer, at Rosa's quiet signal, opened the second bundle from the walnut box and read aloud, for his benefit, a summary of the late Reverend Calvert's trust, its sum of £800, its terms payable to Rosa at the age of 25, and at no other time and on no other condition, and the documented history of what her trustee had done with it. He was offered a choice, chancery in the public ruin of a corn merchant's credit, or immediate restitution of the whole fund, with interest into the hands of new trustees, the lawyer himself and Heb, and he sweated and blustered once and signed. He left Underfell that evening in his hired chaise, discredited, lighter by £940, and was heard of thereafter only at a distance, and never again in that county, and nobody stood wondering what had become of him, because everybody had watched him sign. Lady Drusilla Verrill did not run. That, Rosa always afterwards said, was the one thing to be said for her, and it turned out to be enough to build on. She came to the Grange 2 days later, alone, and stood in Stokes Plain kitchen in her fine pelisse, and confessed the letters, and did not cry until the end. What came out of her was not wickedness, but terror, the particular genteel terror of a woman of 30 with a mortgaged name, 3 younger sisters, and no way left to fall but through marriage or through charity, and she had connived with a thief against a stranger, because the stranger stood between her and the only safety she had ever been taught to imagine. Rosa heard her out, and thought of herself at 19, bolting 200 miles from a widower with damp hands, and understood that she was looking at the woman she might have become if the advertisement had never been printed. She did not pretend the harm away, but she went to the Duke, and it was Rosa's asking, and everyone knew it was Rosa's asking, that settled on Lady Drusilla the tenancy of the dower house at a peppercorn rent, and the management of the new dame school at Underfell, at a salary, her own, dependent on no husband, and within 2 years the sharp eyes that had hunted Rosa's secrets were hunting out which cottager's child had come to school hungry, and finding them, and feeding them. The county debated that mercy longer than it debated anything else in the whole affair, whether she had got better than she deserved. Rosa thought that most people did, one way or the other, and that it was the direction of the error that told you what a house was worth. The Duke came to Stokes Farm the week after the rent day, on foot, hat in hand, past the Red Cow, who inspected him at the gate with deep suspicion and had to be spoken to. He did not offer excuses, which Rosa noted, and he did not offer positions, which she noted more. He asked whether Miss Calvert, as receiver of Underfell, would do the estate the honour of directing its restoration, at proper terms, through her own attorney, and Rosa said that she would, and they shook hands over it like 2 farmers, and Stokes' youngest, watching from the woodpile, reported to the kitchen that the Duke had smiled, or very nearly, and was not believed. All the rest of that summer and into the autumn they rebuilt. The drainage channels were scoured, and the flooded meadow came back to grass. The kiln was lit, every lease at Underfell was resurveyed and rewritten fair, read aloud to its tenant, and signed fresh, and the first roof thatched on the whole estate, by written order of the receiver, countersigned by the Duke without being asked, was Widow Peascod's. His regard for Rosa was by then perfectly visible to the entire parish, in the way he rode out of his way, in the way he had begun to read everything and signed slowly, in the way he stood a little straighter when her pony cart came up a lane, and the parish waited with great patience for it to become visible to the Duke himself, and made wagers. He spoke at the harvest home. It was held in the great barn at Underfell Grange, the first merry night on that land in a decade, with lanterns swinging up into the rafters, and the fiddler tuning while the long tables were cleared away, and the Duke of Thornley, who had come, everyone assumed, to show his face for an hour and leave, instead crossed the whole floor in the hush his crossing created, and stopped before Rosa Calvert, and asked before the assembled tenantry of Underfell whether she would do him the honour of becoming his wife, and because he had learned, at last, to read things fully before signing them, he said the rest plainly. He said he was aware that she needed nothing from him. Her fortune was restored, and her own. Her position was granted under seal by a wiser head than his, and could not be revoked. Her people, and he gestured at the barnful of them, were her own earning. He was not offering her shelter, he said, because she was the one soul in the county who did not require it. He was asking, he said, because his mother had sent him a plain calf-bound book by way of a message, and it had taken him from spring to harvest to read it, and what it said was that the truest thing on his land had been standing in front of him since the morning she faced down his bailiffs over a widow's cow, and that he did not intend to be a coward on the second occasion. The barn held its breath. Rosa looked at him for a long moment, and then said that she accepted, upon conditions. The Duke, gravely, asked to hear them. First, that Widow Peascod's chimney, which still smoked in an east wind, be seen to before the wedding. Second, that no lease on any Thornley land, to the end of his days, ever again be signed unread. And third, that he be advised the piquet scores would be honestly kept, which was more than his mother had ever endured. The Duke of Thornley laughed, and the parish heard it, and the fiddler, a man of decision, struck up before the echo died. They were married in the parish church at Advent, quietly at her wish, with Matthias, Stoke and Heb for witnesses, and the school children throwing wheat. In the spring, when Rosa turned 25 and her father's £800 came into her hands at last, whole and restored with its interest, she did not put a shilling of it to the great house. She built with it, on Underfell land, a row of 6 sound cottages with tight roofs and deep windows, and let them at fair rents to the oldest tenants, and the first key was carried by the whole village in procession because the whole village insisted to Widow Peascod, who wept and then apologised for the weather. The row was called Hortensia Row, and the stone over the well at the end of it carried one line, chosen by the Duchess's son and cut deep, which said that a ledger honestly kept is the one honest room in the world. Heb stayed on to a great age, and it is from his telling, passed down the pantry the way the truest histories are, that the tale of the story comes. He would say that he had watched the house die by 100 small surrenders, and watched it come back the same way, by 100 small keepings, a book ruled fresh, a roof made tight, a rent read true, and that the grandest thing he saw in 40 years of service was not the wedding, nor the assizes, nor the county bowing at last to the woman it had watched turned out with the furniture. It was an ordinary rent day, years on, when the tenants of Underfell came up the lane unafraid to the long table under the elm, where her Grace the Duchess of Thornley sat at the book with ink on her finger, while the old red cow's granddaughter dozed at the gate behind her, and the Duke stood at his wife's shoulder, not because the rents required him, but because he liked to watch the columns come out true. The old Duchess's portrait hung where the light found it every morning, and no one in that house said, "I am sorry for your loss" any more. They said her name and told the stories, and kept the books honest, which, as her Grace had always maintained, was the only condolence the dead can spend.